So I'm from Montgomery, Alabama, which is considered the heart of the civil rights movement. And so really growing up, there wasn't a lot that you would think about because it was just our everyday environment, just growing up. But there are two things that I remember. One of them, my mom told me about when I was older. And so in our neighborhood, there was one white family in our neighborhood, and I would play with her son. And we were really young. So, 3, 4, 5, right around in there. And when we turned around 10, he stopped coming over. And so this is my mom telling me the story that I came to her and I said, hey, why doesn't, his name was Billy, why doesn't Billy come over anymore? And all she kind of said then was, well, his parents don't want him to come over anymore. And I didn't understand why. And then as I got older, she shared that for some reason, when kids are younger, kids play together, and you kind of see that a lot. But once you get older, then you start to see this divide from a racial perspective. And then the other was just my personal experience. I am a musician. I play saxophone in the band. And after games, our band director would tell us to wear our uniforms proudly so people would know which high school you went to. And so we were at a Pizza Hut at the end of a game, and there were 4 of us in our uniforms just sitting there. There was another table that was 3 or 4 African-American students and a white student. And the waitress comes over to another table that was asking to be reseated. And she asked, why do you want to be reseated? And she said, well, I can't sit here looking at her talking about the white girl sitting there with a bunch of, and she was gonna say the N-word, and then she looks at us and she just left it. I can't sit here and see her sitting there with a bunch of, and she kind of frowned. And so they reseated her and then came back and apologized to us, but they moved that family. And that was probably the first time I felt like there was something different. That one really did hurt. So there's an interesting thing that happens when you talk about issues of race. And you hear people talk about systemic racism, and you think about kind of external factors holding a particular race back, right? Or gender even, you think about it that way. But what happens when you grow up in a certain environment, that becomes your norm until something happens to kind of shake you. And then you start paying attention to things that are around you that that maybe don't share your personal value set. And so I would tell you, growing up, I'm certain that was happening around me, and I never paid any attention to it until that event. And maybe that high school event shook me because I was just there with my buddies from high school. We weren't doing anything. We were just eating pizza. And there you have this table where they clearly don't want to be sandwiched between the 2 tables because of race. And so at that point I started to pay more attention to it. But we would go to Florida all the time. And with our high school band, or we'd do a field trip or whatever to Pensacola, Florida, or someplace like that. And you could literally be walking down the street to go to McDonald's or something, and people would just pull up and yell the N-word out and maybe flip you off or something. That was a common thing that would happen. That probably happened every time I was in this part of Florida. And then at that point, the other thing about race that's not great is you build up a resilience or a resistance to it, and you become numb to it. And neither one of those are good when you're trying to make change. For one group to feel like, well, this is just the way it is, or to become numb to things that are happening to you. And this sounds weird, but for me it's true. I actually prefer the racism of the South. And so I'll use a very stark example. And so in our neighborhood, most people were African American. Everybody was some kind of professional. And so it wasn't a gated community, but there was one way in, one way out. There was a gas station on the corner who owned Mr. Sharp. It was a Gulf service station. He owned it, and he's African American, worked with my father at the technical college. In the back of the gas station were 3 restrooms, and one was colored, one was white, and then one was, I guess you'd say, mixed gender or whatever, however you say that today. He left the colored up there when he bought the gas station from a previous white owner. And he left it there just so when people would come, he could remind people of where we were. Now, I was born in 1969. And so I prefer that. If you don't want me to use your restroom for whatever reason, and it's as trivial as saying, you're too tall to be here, right? To me, the color of your skin is that trivial. But at least in Alabama, I know I don't want you to be there. And so, newsflash, I don't want to be around people who could cause physical harm to me if you don't want me to be there. Now, I still want things to change, but I prefer knowing what your personal value system is without having to interact with you. And so there's some comfort in having that. The flip side here is you don't know that. And so you're interacting with people in the Minnesota nice, you actually don't know what people's value systems are. And so that is more threatening. And in some instances, I think it causes more emotional harm because James Pierce doesn't know why he didn't get the promotion. He's just as qualified as another candidate, but he may not get that job just because he's Black, and there's some unconscious or conscious bias that this hiring manager has. Or my wife and I were going to a restaurant and the security guard was gonna arrest me and said I was being threatening. And all I was doing, it was cold out, I said, hey, could you let my wife stand inside because it's freezing out here. They needed to, it was one of those speakeasy places. And I said, let her stand inside because it's cold, I'll stand outside. And he was threatening to call the police, and all of that happened because I'm a tall Black man. And so it just, I think it stings more the way it happens here, because again, you can lull yourself into feeling like this is a safer, it's from a racial perspective, it's not as bad, but the outcomes are very similar. I think it is just as simple as what I started with, and it's about the environment. And so the South has a certain environment, a culture, and the North has a certain culture. But what we have to do is start to change those cultures. And this sounds simple every time I say it, but it is hard to do this. But my wife and I talk a lot about the future that's in our kids. And so I've spoken to a lot of families where I will just say, You don't have to jump into the mix right now. I know you want to do something because of the George Floyd murder or whatever situation is happening in the US, but you don't have to jump in right now. You've got 2 young kids. The biggest thing you can do is raise inclusive kids. So if you can focus on that, what we know statistically is every generation is more inclusive than the previous generation. And so the kids today are growing up with more of an opportunity to have a culture of fluency than I ever had. And I'll tell this story because I think it really underscores that point. My oldest, Olivia, we would go back to Montgomery. And there's this one time we were walking through Walmart and she's got this huge smile on her face. She has the big afro. And I asked her, what are you smiling about? And she goes, oh, Dad, I'm home and it's so diverse here. And I literally stopped in Walmart and I said, Olivia, it's not diverse here. And she said, well, what do you mean? And I said, it is probably 90+% African American. In this Walmart, it might be 100%. And that's not good for you either. Now, you may feel great because you are in a situation where you're not the minority anymore. And there is emotionally, there's some healing that comes from that. But kids who are growing up in Montgomery, Alabama, that's all African American or predominantly African American, that's no better for them than someone growing up in Minnesota and everybody's white. What you need is for people to understand other races, understand other differences, and learn to appreciate those. And that's what I mean by starting to cultivate a more inclusive culture. And so some of the things that the city has done this year, the arts in the park, right? That was awesome, bringing different people together. The recognition of special holidays and having kids, right, do posts about whether it's Black History Month. We did a few of those. Those types of things start to foster a different culture that can be more inclusive. And I think it is just that simple, because what will happen is those kids will continue to mature, grow up, they'll move on to do different things, but in the back of their minds, they know what an inclusive, healthy environment looks like, and they'll continue to advocate for it. Being on the city council in the context of creating a culture that appreciates differences, I think representation really matters. And so me being on the council, I don't even have to say anything. Right? There have been kids once I was elected. I remember going out and taking up signs, and there were kids that thought it was cool to have an African American elected to council. I got an email from a family, a Somalian family, that said, wow, my kids have said, hey, I can do that now. And all they're doing is looking up and they're seeing difference. And it just removes a barrier. At the end of the day, it's not a Black agenda or a white agenda. It's all about what can we do to help the city reflect the values that we've chosen as a city. And I think having that representation definitely helps. The other thing I would say that I talk about a lot, and this again is just having different perspectives represented. I talk a lot about equity, and many people think of equity more from a financial standpoint, but in the city we talk about that as equitable access, right? So on the roadways, we need equitable access. For the sidewalks, we need to make sure it's equitable. If we're doing designing a building, Well, people who are differently able need to be able to have access. And so when you start to have the conversation around what does equity mean, but you have multiple different perspectives at the table, I think we come up with a better solution for everybody, actually, not just one particular race or what have you. And so I hope that that is something that I am able to bring to the council, that different perspective. And I'm excited to be able to have that, to continue to have that opportunity.